So let's move on to the RC3. Remember, I'm going to use a different credential to log in for RC3. Remember that you want to go to nreca.axio.com. You'll want to use exactly the same credential to sign in at nreca.axio.com that you use to sign in at publicpower.axio.com. And you'll see that the interface is slightly different, or the sort of skin on the platform is slightly different, but the functional interface is exactly the same. So again, if you haven't created an account, you can also follow that registration process at nreca.axio.com. If you haven't done that yet, click on the register button, use your work email to register, and that'll bring you ultimately to this dashboard. If you don't have any assessments, this is what you'll see when you first log in, this sort of high-level instructions with a pointer down to this button as your indication that this is what you want to click to create a new assessment. If you do have assessments that you're working on or that you've completed and continue to work on, then you'll see your dashboard. We covered this briefly at the end of the lightweight, the light dive. Now we're in the deep dive. I'm going to go another layer deeper. And I want to start here again by talking about when you create assessment, when you start an assessment, what kind of planning do you want to do for having the right people around the table for completing this assessment? Because this is the beginning of your cybersecurity journey. This is sort of building your baseline and establishing sort of that starting point in your journey to make some improvement for cybersecurity. That's the benefit of doing an assessment. So Cynthia, can you tell us what you've seen from your members and what you've shared as best practice for co-ops as they begin the RC3? Who should be involved?
Thanks, David. So this is a team building effort. We designed this tool to help you bring all the people to the table to build up that team to change that culture inside your organization. You can do it virtually, and of course now that's what most people are doing. We really strongly recommend that you have your executive leadership, whether that's your CEO or general manager. We recommend that you have your IT person, but for a lot of co-ops, there isn't necessarily a full-time IT staff. So you might want to bring in your IT provider at some portions to answer questions. And David may go into the ability of you to send out a blank assessment to an IT provider to have them help you answer the questions. You're going to need your communications folks in the room. You're going to need your finance people, absolutely, and finance and processing and payroll. You're going to need your HR people, and you're going to need your engineering and ops. So there are questions in here. If you look at it, the IT team is not going to be able to answer most of the questions. It's designed to help you facilitate that conversation across all the job roles so that everybody in your co-op or your utility begins to understand that every single job role has a unique role in cybersecurity, whether they're handling data or they're handling the actual operations equipment. So you can do it virtually, you can do it one-on-one, you can do it as a facilitated exercise virtually. We've done it in person virtually, and maybe there'll be a time when we can do that again. But right now we've seen a lot of co-ops just doing it. Maybe a small team starts with it, and then they start having ongoing meetings with other members of their organization.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia. And that's a great reminder that cybersecurity is a team sport, and there are folks all across your organization that might be making decisions on a day-to-day basis that have a cybersecurity impact. And so building a group mentality or a sort of a full organization mentality about managing this risk is a really powerful way to undertake the improvement of your cybersecurity posture as an organization. So look, there are a couple of things I want to point out before we leave the dashboard. One is I talked about sharing over on the public power. The sharing works the same way. If I click that sharing icon, it opens up the sharing window. And as Cynthia mentioned, one of the things that you could do, so we have the ability here to share the assessment with a third party turned on. So let me close this for a second. And if you wanted to create an assessment that you want to have completed by your like IT outsource provider, for example, you could create it here. You can save it. Now I've got that assessment open. I'm going to go back to the dashboard. There's that demo IT provider. I could now say, okay, I'm actually going to share that with John Fry at Axio.com, and I'm going to ask John to complete that assessment. Because I have external sharing turned on, it turns orange to indicate that I'm now sharing it with somebody outside the organization. I can add a message to John to help me complete this. And then I can also carbon copy myself. I can invite John. Now I've created that assessment. I've shared it with John, a third party, somebody outside my organization with a different email address, right? Because I'm at coopdemo.org and John is at axio.com. And so now John just got an email asking him to complete that assessment. And once he's completed that assessment, I could go back into the sharing interface and say, okay, I'm now going to give him read-only access only. So I'm going to change his access to read-only. So I can now lock that in and say, you can't change it anymore. We're going to lock it in there. But I might come back to John, next year at this time and have him update it. But I've now memorialized it by changing his access to read only, or you could unshare it altogether as another option if you want to just be finished with it. So that's the use case that Cynthia just talked about for sharing. Cynthia, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, so one of the things, it might not be that your outside provider needs to answer all the questions, and David's going to talk about how you can flag questions so that you can direct them to certain subsets of the questions.
Perfect. Perfect segue. So let's jump back into the assessment interface. And this should look familiar from our earlier discussion. Remember, we talked earlier about the first objective in Identify, which is inventorying hardware assets. And notice before I leave this very first question, a couple of things. Remember that you answer by simply clicking on the answer. You set the target by holding down the Shift key and clicking on the target. Another thing I want to show you up here is see this big profile button that's currently in current mode? If I turn that to target mode, it changes these progress bars to show gaps in having set the target. And it also changes the interface. So now I click to set the target and I shift click to current. So you can see that by unanswering the target for this first question, I've created a gap there in Identify, which is a clue. And also over here, I see that I've now only targeted 69 out of 70. So putting the interface in target mode is a great way if you're setting a target profile, and I strongly encourage you to set a target profile. Look, when we rolled out the ability to create a target profile while you're doing an assessment, the change in the atmosphere of an assessment shifted dramatically because it went away from the, oh gosh, look, oh, there's all this stuff we have to do, and oh, we really stink because we're not doing that. That all went away because the conversation turned to one of planning and imagining how you're going to prioritize what you can get done as a change over the next 2 to 3 years, which is my recommended planning horizon for a target profile. So I strongly encourage you to complete a target profile. And I just wanted to mention that target profile mode as a great way to keep track of whether you've set all of the targets across all of the questions. For now, I'm going to go back into the current profile mode, which is again, click to answer, shift click to set target. Now, in that demo, in that assessment that I sent John Fry, I could have opened it up and gone through and just flagged the questions that I wanted John to answer. And then in John's interface, he could use this next flagged button to move from flagged practice, flagged question to flagged question, and just answer all of the flagged items. And I could have sent John a note that said, just please answer all of the items that I've flagged in this assessment to enlist his help in completing my RC3. So that's the feature that Cynthia mentioned about flagging. This icon here with the check mark says that I have created one action item for this question. Action items excuse me, action items are here. You can have, hundreds of action items if you want for any of these questions in RC3. There are also action items in the interface for the full C2M2 over in the last part of the demo. To create an action item, you just type the action here. And look, if you don't know the answer to a question, it's a really good, I use this routinely when I'm leading an assessment and somebody says, gosh, we're just not sure about the answer because, we really need to talk to Sally about that, or we really need to talk to Joe about that. So my advice for you, if you're in an assessment and that happens to you, create an action item for yourself to reach out to John or Joe or Sally or whoever it is you need to reach out to. But in the meantime, answer it to the best of your abilities. And you might even capture a note. We'll talk about notes in a minute. You might capture a note about why you're uncertain. And so this is a really good strategy. Mark the flag, create an action item to, for example, consult with Joe about this answer. You can even assign that action to somebody else. So I could say consult with Chuck, because I might want to talk to Chuck about this. And then I can set a due date for that. And I could even assign that to somebody. In this case, I'm going to assign it to John. And now I've created that action item and it shows up as an action item that is assigned to John on this date. Cynthia, while we're on that topic of sort of being uncertain about an answer, can you share, you give really good advice in my experience of being strategic about how you answer one of these questions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the RC3 self-assessment is a tool for your cooperative. No one's going to be looking over your shoulder. It's really designed for you to use however you think it's going to be most useful. So when you go into this, you might be in a different, there's a whole bunch of corporate information, which is why you want your leadership there. So maybe you want to use a self-assessment, for example, to help you identify areas that you want to put in the budget for the next year. In that case, when you get to a question and it's not a definite no, and it's not a definite yes, maybe it's a partial, but that in between where you've maybe done a little bit of it, but not a lot, you might want to then say, actually, it's a no. Because when it shows up as a no, that short list of no's is what you're going to bring to the CEO and the board to say, here are the things that we want to accomplish. But maybe you've already made progress and what you want to demonstrate is where you are is pretty solid and you just want to highlight the things that are sort of nagging at the side. You might say partial then. You might be more aggressive and say, actually, we're partial on this. You might want to say yes on things to demonstrate that you've really gotten a lot of progress already. And the purpose of doing this tool is to show that you're in very good standing, right? So no one's going to be looking over your shoulder about how you answer these. Answer these so that the tool helps you accomplish your longer term goals, whether that's planning for a budget or demonstrating progress. So maybe you're really close to completing something. There's a lot of low hanging fruit here, and you're going to err and sort of answer it partial because you know in the next 5 months, you're going to get to yes. So if you're doing a quarterly report with your board, you'll be able to demonstrate they're low-hanging fruit, you're pretty close, you're going to say partial, and in the next quarterly report, you're going to be able to demonstrate that you got to yes. So how you answer these questions is really going to be based on how you want to use the tool.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. Just a couple of other user interface items before I jump forward and cover some additional parts of the RC3. You can also set a date for the target. And this is a good practice. Look, if you're planning an improvements over the next 2 years, you might start by just saying which year you're going to get this done in. So I might say, look, I'm really going to prioritize to have this done in 2021. So I'm just going to go ahead and set the target date for that to be the end of 2021. And by chunking the targets as you go through by date, it'll help you start to prioritize the order on which you're going to undertake these improvements. Now, even if you've answered yes, and that's the strongest answer, it's still recommended that you set target at yes also. Otherwise, that's not going to get counted in the target score that shows up on your dashboard. So remember to set targets even if you're answering yes. I mentioned notes earlier. There are notes associated with each and every, notes and action items are associated with each and every question. So if I move on to the second question, you see I have a different answer of action items and notes. Notes are threaded. So John, if you happen to be logged in here and want to enter a note on identify question 2, you know, we'll see that show up. One of the things that, look, our development team.
Dave, I am in. I popped one in there for 1.
Oh.
And I'll add one for 2 as well.
There you go. There you go. No, that's fine. I'll go back to 1. So there's a note that John just added at 11:55 a.m. So that was 2 minutes ago. One of the things that we've done with the platform is made it a very rich environment for remote collaboration, which in this era of COVID, work from home or work remotely, has been really helpful in completing assessments. So John and I could be logged into the same assessment, working together, capturing notes and coming to agreement on answers. When I answer something, he'll see it change on his screen. He enters a note or action item, I'll see it instantly on my screen. So it's a very rich collaborative environment for sort of remote collaboration for completing an assessment and a plan. The evidence tab is a way to take your rigor around an assessment to the next level by actually making a list of the evidence that you would give somebody if they came in looking for evidence that you've actually answered this correctly. Now, it's entirely optional, but just know that that evidence tab is there and you can enter the name and location of as many documents as you want in that evidence tab as a way to say, hey, look, we have this inventory and here's where you can find it, right? It's actually laying down those trail of breadcrumbs for somebody who might come behind you and say, hey, I didn't really know that we had that, right? So that's a way that you can use evidence. And then there is help for each of the questions. The help in the RC3 is really at the objective level. So you're gonna see the text about the objective for each in the help tab for each one of the questions. So with that, now I want to take a lively hop, skip, and jump through the 5 sections of RC3 and give you a sense of the breadth of coverage of RC3. So we already talked about identify. We covered these first 2 objectives before the break. Notice that we have content in here on threats and vulnerabilities, background checks, physical security, policies and procedures for physical security and cybersecurity, information sharing, requiring individual user accounts, and addressing and maintaining security of third-party relationships. So that's the full identify. If I jump forward to protect, you'll notice that the very first objective is secure our network. And the very first question there is about using a firewall. Notice that this says, do you use a firewall to filter incoming and outgoing traffic, right? I'm shortening it for the sake of brevity, but are you using a firewall to filter incoming and outgoing traffic? You know, modern firewalls do a lot more than just traffic filtering, but this question is looking for that core basic of at least you've got firewalls in place and configured to do that as a protective mechanism on your network perimeter, right? And then have we segmented our internal network to enforce least privilege? In other words, to restrict access to specific network segments based on job role. This is a really good security practice around your OT network or operational network, whatever you might call it in your utility. But segmenting that internal network is a great way to sort of build some fire blocks, if you will, in that internal network that helps prevent an attacker who might make it into your perimeter from effectively moving around and getting to a larger part of your network. I'm going to hit the next flag here and see where it takes us next. Geez, I thought I wanted to cover this too. There we go. I'm going to jump back here for a second. So protect. The second objective is protect is about patching operating systems and applications. And we talked about this a little bit over on the scorecard, that a lot of a lot of the vulnerabilities we deal with on a month-to-month basis in our systems are patchable vulnerabilities. We can close those vulnerabilities simply by applying software updates. And this covers them in terms of operating systems and applications. One of the things you want to be very aware of here is that patching them on the OT side of the house is very different than patching on the IT side of the house, right? So patching on your sort of corporate network is very different than patching on your industrial control systems network. And so those are very likely to happen at a completely different rhythm, where patching on the industrial control system side of the house is typically done at a much lower frequency and with much more caution to sort of test and verify that those patches aren't going to have an operational impact before you roll them out to everything. So that's just something to keep in mind about patching. Cynthia, did you have something to add there?
No, it is really hard to keep track of this. So most people are not going to be able to say yes easily because it's both the corporate and the operational system. So if you are answering yes to this, you might want to check with your engineering and ops team and get a feel for how frequently they patch and what some of the constraints are that will help you understand why they don't patch immediately. Building that relationship across those roles is always beneficial, and that's how we're going to get more security across the org.
Great, thank you for that. So notice also in Protect, we cover setting up web and email filters, encrypting sensitive information, the disposal of computers and media like hard drives, or a lot of printers and fax machines, and there are other sort of digital assets that you may have plugged into your network that have hard drives and other forms of memory that need to be wiped before you dispose of them. And then training is the final objective in the Protect section. Moving forward to Detect, there are 3 objectives in Detect. First is on antivirus and anti-malware. The second is on maintaining and monitoring logs. So remember, we talked about logging and monitoring over in the scorecard. And in RC3, as we've seen in other places, we see a little finer grained treatment of that. Do we have logging enabled on all operational cyber assets? So this term throughout RC3, operational cyber assets, refers to those elements of your network that are responsible for the delivery of power, right? That's your industrial control systems or OT elements. The next question is, do you have logging enabled on sensitive cyber assets? Those are the IT assets that contain or process sensitive information as part of your environment. So in Detect, we cover that, maintaining and monitoring logs. So there are questions down here around monitoring logs as well. Do we have a procedure, and do we have a process? And you'll see this pattern a couple of times in RC3, where it starts by saying, do we have a procedure? And that is MIL2 or intermediate level question in RC3. And then we have a question on, do we have a documented process? And that's a MIL3 or the highest level of maturity question in RC3. We talked about having firewalls earlier. Detect also has an objective around installing and updating firewall rules. Obviously, firewalls are only as effective as the rules that you have in the firewall. So maintaining those rules over time is an important element of a cybersecurity program, and there's a whole section of questions in RC3 about maintaining firewall rules. Respond only has one objective, and it is about developing a plan for disasters and cybersecurity incidents. And it starts with a simple question of, do we have incident handling procedures? Notice this is a MIL1 question in RC3. And these don't have to be written, right? Do we have a procedure? It doesn't have to be written. And then down below, we'll see, do we have a written one? And are we updating them? And do we train employees on incident handling and contingency procedures? So the respond, sort of responding to operational risks or natural disaster impacts, and cybersecurity impacts is covered collectively in this one section of RC3 called Respond with a single objective. And then the final objective, or the final section of RC3 is Recover. There are 3 objectives in Recover, and I'll talk a little bit about the first one. We know, if you watch the news or read any trade journals on cybersecurity, you know that ransomware is an enormous problem in the world today, and it has become a very effective and lucrative criminal enterprise. So I don't anticipate that it's going away very soon as a risk to our IT and OT systems. There are ransomware that are going after OT systems now. We saw that in Norsk Hydro last year, major aluminum manufacturing company in Northern Europe. And so backups, having backups that you can count on, having backups that are reliable, that you've tested, and that are protected from destruction by a ransomware criminal are key elements of a ransomware defense for any organization. And so in Recover, there's a whole objective on backups that that contain questions to help you evaluate your posture relative to your backup procedures, and to make sure that you have data that would be necessary should you have to recover from kind of a blank slate. There's also an objective in here about having insurance, a way to transfer the financial impact of risk to an insurance company. And then finally, there's an objective on improving processes, procedures, and technologies. So that is a whirlwind overview of the content in RC3. And so, we talked earlier about a report. There is a full report button here. If you haven't answered all the questions, notice if I unanswer that question, I cannot run the report. So if you notice that you can't run the report, it's just an indication that you haven't answered one or more questions. And you can see in a couple of places that, like in Recover, I see a gap now in that progress bar, which tells me that I have a gap in the Recover section. I can also see over here in the sidebar that I've only answered 6 out of 7 questions in Recover. So if I now go answer that question, I can run the full report. I've already done that for you. We had it on the screen earlier, but this report provides finer grained information than is available on the dashboard. So you might find some of the graphics here to be helpful, just like in the scorecard report. And we have how you've answered both current and target for every one of the questions in RC3 in a, downloadable PDF document. From a day-to-day perspective, I find a great deal of value in the dashboard itself. And so before we go into the Q&A section, I just want to cover briefly the dashboard on RC3. And I talked about these score wheels in the earlier section. These are out of a score of 500. The one on the left is a milestone. You can select that milestone by clicking on this icon under the name of the assessment, and then you'll have a list of milestones you've created. You can create a new milestone by selecting that milestone indicator there, describe it, select a date, and the platform will show you what your score was on that date. These score wheels, a couple of more details about the score wheels. The small numbers in the segments are your score for each section. So at initial completion, I was at a 57, excuse me, and identify, and I'm currently at a 78 out of 336, and my target is 86. So I'm actually getting really close to my target in the identify section for this demo that we've created for the webinar. The color intensity of these rings is another indication. So you see that's much lighter blue, and the 86 is a darker blue, because I'm getting to that point of the maximum score there is 100 points out of 500 for identify. And so you can see your progress that way. We're not yet publishing benchmark data for RC3. When we do, it'll show up here in the same way that you saw it over on the scorecard. These 3 speedometers show your relative score for the MIL1 or basic content in RC3 versus the intermediate content and the advanced content. And you can see that, you know, I didn't do a great job answering this scorecard because I did it in haste for the purposes of creating a demonstration, because you would expect to see a higher score for MIL1 than at MIL3. So you'd expect this to be your highest score, your medium score, and your lowest score, because these are the hardest things in RC3. And these are kind of, your mileage, of course, may vary, but I would expect to see the strongest percentage score at MIL1 and the weakest percentage score at MIL3. This is that same implementation levels over time. If you're making improvements, the dark blue will be eating the lighter blue. Here's a list of upcoming targets that you've set. If you've set dates, they're organized by date. Otherwise, they're organized by their position in the questionnaire, and you can expand them to see the full list. Similarly for action items, look, there's a list of open action items here, and you can mark those action items complete right here on the dashboard, and it will change them as complete. If I jumped back into the assessment by clicking on that link, it would take me to that practice, and I would see that that action has now been marked complete in the platform. So that's a little bit about the dashboard. And with that, I'd like to enter the question and answer period that we have set aside. So we have about 15 minutes left in our time together today, and I'll throw open the floor for questions. In the meantime, I'm going to give, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'm going to ask Cynthia another question on how she has seen her members use the information provided on the dashboard and in the report.
Thanks, Dave. So it's been a mix. I know some of the co-ops are taking snapshots of these assessment scores and using that either in their leadership team meetings. In some cases, they are presenting it to the board, depending on the relationship with the board. I have heard a lot of feedback that the ability to track tasks and assign tasks and the way that you can interact with the platform has made it very useful to them. The final report, which David showed you in the light version of this demo earlier on, the final report has a lot of different kinds of ways to display the graphical information. So you may find that certain graphics work better than others. These little speedometers that you see were actually developed by one of our co-ops, because what we call that donut, that circle that David's showing on the left, those donuts were actually a lot harder for board members to understand the importance of the donut. And they found the speedometers a lot easier to visually understand. So that speedometer capability was actually when we went out and tested it with the 36 co-ops, that was one of the great pieces of feedback that came back that we really acted on.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia. One of the things that I didn't point out earlier is that, you know, if you've captured notes, if you captured notes in the interface, those are summarized at the end of the report for RC3. There's a similar summary at the end of the report for the scorecard, and there's a similar list for the report for the full C2M2 that you'll see in those documents. Those action items are also available, as you saw, on the dashboard here for the RC3, and also on the dashboard for the scorecard. I have a similar list of action items that's interactive on the dashboard and functions the same way, along with the list of targets. So the dashboards for the two are slightly different, but functionally very similar and have very similar widgets on them. So with that, Nathan, do you have anything to add about what your members are saying to you about their use of C2M2, the scorecard, and C2M2, and that sort of progression from starting with one and then leading to the other?
Yeah, getting the scorecard, just to start off, it was set up to be simple, to get someone going, fill out the, the mill one activities, then progress on. Some have said, yeah, that's great. It makes me feel good that I'm doing something and covering those basics, and can move on, and having the connection to the full C2M2, saves them time and pulling that all together. But this is our first time that we've demonstrated both these tools together, and I've seen some some really good ideas that you've developed in the NRECA tool, that might be helpful for munis to use in their evaluation. So we're open to ideas that come out of this, and as they use the tools, what we could do better.
That's a great point, Nathan. And I just want to emphasize it to say that we're also constantly looking for ways to improve the platform experience for both of these. Look, I'm a huge fan of both of them. I think there's a really good role for both of them as part of taking a closer look at your program. They have a slightly different viewpoint, as I hope you've seen through these demonstrations, but they're both really valuable instruments for evaluating your posture. And I wanted to just quickly show that you can send a support email using that menu on the public power, and similarly you can send a support email using the NRECA interface here. We also have a smiley face here that if you're using the platform and have a specific recommendation about a change that you'd like to see, hey, it would really help me if I could do X, Y, or Z. We love that kind of feedback. So if you have anything like that, please use the smiley face, and that goes straight to our development team. And I think we have a question for Cynthia. Cynthia, would you like to answer the question about vendors and external partners?
Right, so there was a question on, if you've got a lot of vendors and external partners, how do you get them engaged in this process? How do you collect the information? That ability to share an assessment. So you can create, let's say you have 4 different vendors that you want input from. You can create 4 new assessments and send each of those vendors their own unique assessment. That flagging ability that David showed, where you can flag certain questions, you can flag the questions that are specific to that vendor, send out that assessment. And then I would recommend, if you can, to actually follow up with them and have a one-on-one conversation with them, because of a lot of the value of this tool. Some of the value is the answer, but a lot of the value is it gives you an opportunity to explore that option and have that conversation, with an end result, which is an answer that is immediately valuable to you. But it can help you facilitate. So if you're talking about remote access, and maybe there's an AMI vendor that has remote access, and you want to have a conversation about what are the security controls around their remote access and how do they maintain that security? Do they do background checks on the people that have remote access? Do they do their own internal security policies? Or maybe it's a new vendor that you're going to work with for medical insurance information and for all of the medical information that your linemen are going to post, and you want to know how they maintain the security of that PII at the vendor end, and what kind of security controls they have to maintain the data to protect the privacy of the data for your linemen. So having that conversation and using this tool is going to be a lot of the value of having this tool. So that ability to share out an assessment, flag specific questions, and then if you want to have a follow-up conversation with them so that they're clear on why you're asking those questions. And this isn't a gotcha. So this really is never meant to be a gotcha, either with the vendors or with you. It's not about finding out all the things that they do wrong. It's about identifying how you can improve. And that conversation can be very touchy sometimes with a vendor, but you are responsible for your members' data and for your employees' data and for keeping the lights on, not the vendor. So you need to be able to have that accountability in both directions, and this gives you a way to sort of gently have that conversation.
Yeah, in support of that, there's one more capability in the platform that I'd like to demonstrate, and this capability is available in both RC3 and the scorecard in the sort of full assessment interface. and it's called reference assessments, and you can get to it through this menu over here at the upper right. And when you select the reference assessments command, so suppose, for example, that I've had a number of vendors complete their parts of assessments. So I've flagged some questions and sent them out. And now I want to look at those and build sort of an amalgam of what my posture looks like as a result of all of those piece parts. Well, one good tip for doing that is to launch reference assessments. And Cynthia, is this new to you? I think we might have just turned this on for RC3. Yeah, okay. So then you can select any assessment that you have access to. So I'm going to select provider number 42, vendor number 43. I'm going to demo IT provider, that assessment for John, and I can add all of those to my screen. I can even drag around the order that I want. Like maybe I want that one up at the top, and I hit OK. What happens in the interface is that then it brings up those other assessments as sort of a reference on the screen for every one of the answers, every one of the questions in RC3. So now I can answer this question, do we have an inventory? And consider the input from these 4 vendors. Now I may not have, clearly I didn't ask these 3 to answer this question, and John answered it no, right? So it's a very helpful look. You can also, you may have noticed that you can bring up a reference from a milestone. So if you create a milestone of some point in the past, right, and bring that up as a reference, you can quickly compare what your answers were then, maybe a year ago, to what your answers are today, as a way to sort of track progress and amalgamate or consider multiple perspectives as you answer your assessment. So that's a relatively new feature for RC3. It is a feature that's also present on the scorecard. So this is both. I'm just demoing here, and that's the reference assessments feature.
David, that capability is also applicable to internal staff, correct?
Absolutely.
So one of the things you'll find, and why you want to bring people together to have these conversations, is you'll have 3 or 4 staff people answer the same question differently. So if you assign out a self-assessment to 3 or 4 staff people, maybe it's finance, maybe it's your risk manager, maybe it's the IT person, and maybe it's the CEO, and you come back and all the answers are different, this lets you put them all together, and then you can have a webinar or a conversation, a joint conversation, and say, okay, we had 4 assessments, these 4 people all answered this differently. As an organization, how do we want to answer this going forward? And let's explore why everybody has a different answer. Again, it's not a gotcha. It's not to say, you should have said this. It's really to see and to reveal. It's a discovery process to reveal how different people in your organization are thinking about cybersecurity.
Perfect. That's another great use case for reference assessments. So I wanted to make sure to cover that, and your answering that question was a good reminder to me to cover that. So thank you, Cynthia. I think, John, do we have any other questions? If not, I'm not seeing any on the, yeah, I see on my.
I was on mute. So we have no other unanswered questions, and we're right at time.
Okay.
So
great.
I think we're all set there.
Super. So I'm going back to PowerPoint land. Remember, you can access the Public Power Cybersecurity Scorecard, publicpower.axio.com. I covered all of these items in the demo. This will be in the materials that we provide to you. In the RC3, we recommend that you access that at nreca.axio.com. I covered all of these activities there. And now I'm going to turn it over to Betsy to bring us home. Betsy?
Thank you, Dave. And thank you everyone again for your time in attending today's workshop. I want to extend a very special thank you to our cybersecurity experts, Chuck, Nathan, Cynthia, and Dave, for their informative presentations and demonstrations today. You can find their contact information there listed for you on this slide, and feel free to directly contact any of today's speakers with your questions. They are happy to help. And additionally, they're all very passionate about this subject matter, and so they'll be glad to take any and all questions that you may have. Additionally, a big thank you goes to the Intuitive, APPA, NRECA, and Axio team members, John, Aaron, Chris, and Grayson in particular, who have contributed their time and expertise to making today's workshop successful. Again, you'll find a recording of today's workshop along with presentation materials on the 7 States website. We will send an email notification when the resources have been posted to the site. And as always, feel free to reach out to 7 States with any cybersecurity questions, and we'll be glad to connect you to the experts. Thank you again for your time and participation today. We are interested in hearing your feedback, and so we just ask that you take a look there at the different ways you can connect with the 7 States rep. And we would love to hear your feedback on today's workshop, thoughts on any future workshops, topics you'd like to see covered. So feel free to send those thoughts to 7 States there. You can reach out, call, email, however is best for you to reach out and send us feedback. We'd love to hear from you. Again, thank you to all of today's presenters and their teams, and thank you to you for logging in and participating as well. And we'll see you at the next one.